Every year, there's at least one Best Picture nominee that sneaks up on people. Train Dreams isn't loud, it isn't flashy, but it stays with you.
It's enough to make a grown man cry.
Train Dreams tells the story of a man whose life would not normally be immortalized. And in doing so, it argues that those lives are just as meaningful as any epic we put on screen. And with that in mind, welcome back to The Rank. I'm John. Just a quick heads up on format. I'll hit a handful of behind the scenes tidbits called the Potent Notables. Then I'll do a movie overview with spoilers. And I'll finish by ranking the movie across 10 categories. And today I'm going to continue ranking the 2025 Best Picture nominees with Train Dreams, starring Joel Edgerton, adapted from the novella by Denis Johnson, with a screenplay by Greg Quidar and Clint Bentley, who also directed. Train Dreams is nominated for 4 Academy Awards, including Best Original Song, Best Cinematography, Best Adapted Screenplay, and of course, Best Picture. So let's find out how this one stacks up, starting with the Potent Notables.
Potent Notables.
As always, we'll start the Potent Notables with the box office info, or in this case, Netflix math. Because Train Dreams was released on Netflix, it didn't have a traditional theatrical run. The film was made on a modest $10 million budget, and Netflix acquired it out of Sundance for $16 million. Since its release, Train Dreams has pulled in 17.7 million views in the second half of 2025, which is a strong showing for a quiet literary film like this. Now, one of the most distinctive elements of the movie is its narration provided by Will Patton, who had actually already narrated the audiobook version of Denis Johnson's novella. And that familiarity with the material really shows. The voiceover feels less like exposition and more like someone gently reading you a life. Despite how much time the film spends in nature, the production was surprisingly restrained. Clint Bentley has said that only a limited number of real trees were cut down during filming. In most scenes where characters appear to be felling a tree, the production used a large artificial prop built from wood and fiberglass, with visual effects extending the trunk and canopy to create the illusion of full-size trees. And finally, in a notable milestone, behind the camera, Adolfo Veloso, the film's director of photography, became the first Brazilian ever nominated for an Academy Award for Best Cinematography, a fitting recognition for a movie so defined by its visual poetry. But those are all the Potent Notables. Let's head to the movie overview. I had no idea what to expect from this movie going into it. I had heard nothing about it other than it had gained Oscar buzz, but right from the first moment, I understood why. This movie is beautiful and lyrical in all the right ways. We open up with narration from Will Patton that sounds as if we're listening to an audiobook. There were once passageways to the old world, and even though that world is gone now, you can still feel the echo. We're hearing prose like that through narration as the camera moves us through beautiful vistas of nature. Then we get to hear about the main character of our story, Robert Grainier. He lived in Idaho for 80 years and had visited as far east as Montana and as far west as to get him only a few miles away from the Pacific Ocean, but he never actually saw the ocean. He didn't know for sure the day or year of his birth or how he had lost his original parents. One of his earliest memories was the mass deportation of Chinese families, and he was baffled by the casual violence of it. He left school in his early teens and drifted through life for about 20 years before meeting Gladys. All of this exposition is done in the first few minutes of the movie. We have an understanding of Robert right away, without ever hearing him speak. We also get a sense of what this movie wants to tell us. The story isn't just about Robert, but about humanity's place within the world. And actually, choosing Robert is the most apt because he has no history that he knows of. The narration is going to continue because we're going to be introduced to Gladys, and we need to feel compelled to root for them as a couple. The economy in storytelling here is moving and beautiful. She comes into his life and seems to give it meaning. And within 3 months of him meeting Gladys, they're inseparable. They decide to get married, and the way they do it is lyrical as well. However, it's not lyrical in a way where they have the characters saying things that don't make sense. When she's asking him what he's thinking about, he says he's thinking they ought to get married. And she says, "We are married. Now we just need a ceremony to prove it." There's a beauty and lyricism to this dialogue for 2 reasons. It's a lovely sentiment that is used metaphorically, but not such deep metaphor and wisdom as to think that these characters would never be so profound. And that, in a nutshell, is what this movie does incredibly well throughout the entire length of the film. Nobody feels wiser than they should. Nobody seems deeper than they should. Everyone inhabits the space that they're given, and they all feel natural in their existence. Gladys and Robert start fantasizing about their their life together. They're playing house, planning where they'll build their cabin. And by the time they're doing this, which is super early in the movie, I'm moved by empathy and I'm rooting for them. We learn that Robert is a traveling logging man. He goes where the jobs are. Most of the men in this industry are itinerant and without families, but Robert has a wife at home, a wife he wants to get home to. Soon thereafter, we find out that he decided to take a railroad job. And that's when we learn the year. It's 1917. All of this beauty that we're seeing in nature and of the dispositions of the humans that we've been able to interact with so far is immediately juxtaposed by a callous act without explanation. Robert is working with a Chinese man on the railroad. But one day, a group of men grab him and pull him up onto the railroad. Meanwhile, Robert is asking what he did, but nobody answers and nobody knows. They get him to the bridge that they've been building and just throw him off of it. And Robert will spend most of the rest of this movie haunted by the thought of this man that he didn't help. He goes home with that man's face indelibly entered into his consciousness. And when he gets home, we learn that Gladys has had a baby. The economy in storytelling apparent again. It's a baby girl, and we can tell how proud of his little family he is. He spends as much time with them as he can, but in an excellent bit of acting by Felicity Jones, there's an undercurrent of sadness with her. You can't quite put your finger on it at first, but when he leaves for the next logging season, we know what it is. She doesn't want him to go, and he doesn't want to go either. He's worrying that he's spending so much time away from home that little Katie, his daughter, won't know that he's her dad. Gladys reassures him, but you can tell that it weighs on her as well. Narration again pulls us in to give voice to the beauty of the story that we're watching. As soon as Grainier felt used to being home, logging season would come and he'd have to leave again. The narrator will introduce us to the men that Robert works with. One is a man that doesn't have much to say. And when he's asked a question, he responds, "Ain't there any place where a man can get some peace?" And that's the only thing that Robert ever heard him say. Then we're introduced to a man that can't seem to stop talking. And mostly he's talking about God and the Bible. But his talking stops when a man shows up looking for Buckskin Sam. There's a palpable tension. And eventually the chatty guy gets up and runs. And the man that was looking for Buckskin Sam shoots him in the back, then walks up to him and shoots him again. The man who killed him was a black man. And he tells everyone there that Sam had killed his brother in '93 and that he had killed him merely because of the color of his skin. And so now it's another death that Robert is in close proximity to. And after this, we get to meet Arn. He's the oldest man in the group, and he's mostly there for demolition. He works with dynamite, and the rest of the time, he kind of just talks shit. But he is played brilliantly by William H. Macy. Arn's age and experience gives him wisdom. He's more thoughtful than most, though Robert is quite thoughtful too. So them becoming friends fits. We get a scene where Arn is singing, and everyone else in the camp wants him to stop because they're trying to sleep, but Robert doesn't really mind. He's still getting visions of the Chinese man, and he asks Arn if the bad things they do in life follow them. And Arn says he doesn't know because he's seen bad men lifted up and good men brought to their knees. So the narrator's going to come back and tell us the dangers of his work. There seems to be no end to the world's hunger for lumber, and we see how it reshapes the landscape to have these trees removed. The narrator continues by saying that a good sawyer might judge a tree's fall correctly 99 times, but it's the 100th that might take its toll. Which of course is right before we see that 100th time that the narrator was talking about. 3 more men have now died near Robert. His proximity to death is the undertone of this movie. It whispers its warnings in the beginning, but by the middle, it's screaming them at us, the audience, with a sense of foreboding, with the narrator telling us that Robert is worried that something bad is following him, that it's keeping him from the only place that he really wants to be, home with his family. And when he gets home this time, he says that Katie is like a different person every time he comes back. He's determined not to leave again and tries to find odd jobs close to home. But with the war over, jobs are hard to find. Their money was tight, the narrator tells us. And though he didn't know it then, he would always look back on this time of his life as the happiest, the final nail in the foreboding coffin. And when he said that, I knew I was watching a tragedy. Gladys and Robert dream about having a farm and a sawmill on their land. They can make a living doing that, and Robert won't have to leave. But to get the sawmill going meant that he needed to take one more sojourn into the woods. One long logging trip to earn enough money to get the sawmill started. This was the ominous narration we got. When he leaves, his daughter doesn't want to say goodbye, so he leaves without that. He's back with Arn though. Billy, one of the other guys that's around often, says that he has trouble when a job's almost over, like an aching. And Arn says that's because They're cutting down trees that are 500 years old. It hurts a man's soul whether you realize it or not. The world is intricately stitched together, boys. Every thread we pull, we know not how it affects the design of things. Now, one can make an argument that this feels more sage than somebody in Arn's position would be, but I think that's the only one that even slightly feels that way. And I think they did such a good job establishing what kind of person Arn was that I bought that. But Arn's wisdom won't last much longer. He's killed by a widowmaker, a large branch falling from a tree. He survives for a few days afterward, but each day he gets less aware, and by the end, he doesn't remember who he is. Another death in close proximity to Robert. But this one was the closest to him. He had never experienced a death up to this point that meant that much to him. He began to feel a dread, like that widowmaker was meant for him. Some foreshadowing there. So he's gonna go home again, and when he gets to the train station, there's a great fire, a huge forest fire. And his cabin is gone along with his wife and child, though we can't find any trace of them. And now we know what kind of tragedy it is. He keeps looking for them, and when he stops, he waits for them to come home. Eventually, he will openly accept that they're gone in an incredibly sad scene. But even after that, he builds a lean-to and holds out hope that Gladys and Katie will return. The only thing that seems to keep him going is that some puppies come into his living area. The companionship seems to convince him to rebuild his cabin, which he does. And he starts to move on with his life again and goes back to logging. But now he's the old man, and they're using chainsaws now, which he doesn't know how to use. He eventually runs into Billy and is excited to see a familiar face, but Billy doesn't recognize him. They end up having a discussion, and Robert asks if Billy feels like things are different now, or if he just doesn't remember when he was young and rough. And Billy is basically like, yeah, that's the question. And then he's gonna ask if he's seen Arn leave. Now that's a tough moment because Billy gave the eulogy at Arn's funeral. But instead of turning away from it, Robert ends up helping Billy tie his shoelaces. But he never went back to logging after that. Now, Robert is going to end up meeting another woman that I thought would end up being his love interest. Acclaimed Thompson, played by Carrie Condon. She doesn't end up being a love interest. She's more like the right person to enter his life at the right time. She gives him the comfort to be open about his grief, and she can align with him as well, because she lost her husband. Just to highlight another beautiful moment of lyrical prose that felt real, he tells her that sometimes he hears their voices, there being his wife and child, and that when he's done, he's afraid to turn around because he might scare them away. He asks her if that makes him sound crazy, and she says that when you go through something like that, nothing you do is crazy. You go through what you go through. It's a beautiful sentiment. And then on top of that, to reassure him about his place in life, she says that the world needs a hermit in the woods as much as a preacher in the pulpit. And right after that meeting with Claire, where you think something might happen between them, he finds a girl unconscious in the woods near his cabin. He brings her in and sets her broken leg, and even though it would be impossible, he can't help but think that it's his Katie, that she's come home. He tries to stay awake and watch over her, but eventually he falls asleep, and when he wakes up, she's gone. It's like he's lost her all over again. But whether it was real or not, he's now convinced that he can't leave, just in case she might come back again. The story and the world move on many years later. It's the 60s now, and Robert sometimes rides the train to Spokane just to walk around. He happens upon a little field with some airplanes where they're offering rides for $4. He decides to take a ride, and while he's flying around, he's flooded with memories of his life, of his daughter, of his wife. The narrator's going to cut back in and tell us that he died in his sleep in November of 1968, that his life ended as quietly as it had begun. He'd never purchased a firearm, never spoken into a telephone. He had no idea who his parents might have been, and he left no heirs behind him. But on that spring day when he was flying, as he misplaced all sense of up and down, he felt at last connected to it all. That's just an incredibly moving story. I love that it's told about somebody who never left a mark on the world that anybody would know outside of himself. But the earth knows. It knows that there was a man named Robert Grainier who lived upon it for 80 years. For as Claire Thompson said earlier in the movie, the world's an old place. Probably nothing it hasn't seen by now. But that's the whole movie. Let's find out how it ranked.
A rank.
So the rank is where I rank the movie based on 10 categories: story, acting, originality, film coherence, cinematography, score/soundtrack/sound, script structure and dialogue, character relatability, production value, and my rank. I rank it on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the worst, 10 being the best. But before I dive into the rankings here, if you're enjoying this episode, please leave a like down below. It really does help us out. But without further ado, the first category is story, and this story is tragic and beautiful. It's the story about a man that would probably never have had a story about him if he were real. And in that way, his is the story of every person who will never be immortalized. Their grief, their joy, their accomplishments all existed and therefore are connected to everything else we know. I gave it a 10. That brings us to acting. The acting was incredible. Honestly, how William H. Macy and Felicity Jones aren't nominated for acting is beyond me. Joel Edgerton's acting was understated, and he probably didn't have to do that much because his character was somewhat stoic, but I thought it was a really powerful performance. Honestly, I don't know how it gets much better than this. I gave it a 10. So that brings us to originality. Now, I don't know that this movie is particularly original. It has sweeping narration and is a tragedy, both of which has been done many times before. It blends a lot together, but I wouldn't say it was new. Still though, it felt different to me. I gave it a 7. So that brings us to film coherence. The movie was wonderfully tight in coherence. Not a part of it felt off or wasteful. Every moment felt meaningful, and they didn't need 2.5 or 3 or over 3 hours to do it. It was an epic story that never felt bloated. I gave it a 10. That brings us to cinematography. The cinematography in this is sweepingly beautiful. Everything we see is crisp and clean and meant to be seen towering over you on the big screen. There's a majesty to it. I loved it. I gave it a 9.5. So that brings us to score/soundtrack/sound. The score is very good, understated. It never took over, but it also never took me away. Also, there seems to be an inordinate amount of wind sounds in it, which sometimes felt a little distracting to me, and it made me feel weirdly cold. Anyway, I gave it an 8. So that brings us to script structure and dialogue, and I loved this script. There's nothing I would change about it. The narrator got to say the beautiful things that humans wouldn't normally say to each other, but they didn't take profundity away from the characters, and yet still made them feel real. I gave it a 10. So that brings us to character relatability. It's a character story that worked incredibly well, so it clearly has great relatability. The only thing that I will say is that some of the characters that weren't Robert felt at times a little two-dimensional, and not necessarily in a bad way, just that they were servicing his story, which is what they were doing, but I think I would have liked to have seen a little more internalization with Gladys, and maybe a little more time spent between Claire and Robert. Still excellent though, I gave it an 8.5. So that brings us to production value, and this movie was gorgeous. The sites they chose, the cabin they built, everything felt true. I gave it a 10. And that brings us to my rank. And I loved this movie. I thought it was incredible. It moved me, and not just by the end of it. It moved me several times. Maybe having the family die was cheap to get grief, but it felt earned, and more importantly, it felt like the story was correct with that in it. I've tried to think of a reason to not give it a 10, and I just can't. I gave it a 10. So altogether, that puts Train Dreams at a 93, which makes it an absolute masterpiece. This puts it in first for the 2025 Best Picture nominees, ahead of One Battle After Another. And as far as all time, it ties it with Barbie, just below Oppenheimer, and just above There Will Be Blood and Saving Private Ryan, which are tied at 92.75. And if you're ranking along with me, drop your score in the comments. I'd be curious to find out if you're feeling the same way I did about this movie. But thanks for listening and or watching. Check out my other Best Picture episodes or any of my other movie ranking or sitcom ranking episodes on this channel. Remember to comment, subscribe, and like. For up-to-date rankings, you can check out my website at therankedpodcast.com, where you can also email me at john@therankedpodcast.com. And if you want to support the show, you can become a patron at patreon.com/therankedpodcast. But all right, we've reached the end of the line. Most of the men in this industry are itinerant. God damn it.
That's okay. Take your time.